Can I start?
There it is. Okay. Yes, you can start. Alyssa.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the regular virtual meeting of the City Planning Commission Committee of the Whole. Today is February 11th, 2021. This meeting includes the remote participation of board members and staff as authorized under Minnesota statutes, section 13D.021, due to the declared local public health emergency. My name is Alyssa Olson. I'm the new Vice President of the Planning Commission. And I will call this meeting to order. Will the clerk please call the roll to verify quorum?
Baxley. Caprini. Smiley.
Here.
If you called my name, I didn't hear you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm working on mic issues. Yes, Ford.
I'm here.
Great, thank you. Marwa. McGuire. Meyer.
Here.
Schrader. Sweezy.
Here.
Olson.
All right. Oh,
Yeah.
here.
That's 5 here. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a quorum. So next we will proceed to the agenda. A copy of the agenda was posted on the public, for public access to the city's legislative information management system, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. Can I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
Sweezy, so moved.
Do I have a second?
Second, Smiley.
Thank you. So we have a motion and a second. Clerk, please call the roll.
Baxley. Caprini. Smiley.
Aye.
Ford.
Aye.
Marwa.
Aye.
McGuire. Meyer.
Aye.
Schrader. Sweezy.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
That's 6 yeas.
All right, that motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Next on the agenda is the acceptance of the minutes of the regular meeting on December 10th, 2020. Do I have a motion to accept those minutes? Commissioner Smiley.
I move to accept the minutes of December 10th Committee of the Whole.
Do I have a second?
Second, Meyer.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Baxley.
Here.
Caprini. Smiley.
Aye.
Ford.
Abstain.
Marwa.
Aye.
McGuire. Meyer.
Aye.
Schrader. Sweezy.
Aye.
Olson.
Aye.
That's 6 yeas and 1 abstention.
All right, that motion passes. Next is our consent agenda. And first up is item number 4, appointments to the Zoning Board of Adjustment. And staff is Brad Ellis.
Hi, this is Brad Ellis, Manager of Zoning Administration and Enforcement, and the staff that handles the Board of Adjustment. These are 3 reappointments to the Board of Adjustment. They've all been long-serving, except for Taylor, who has been on just the 1 cycle. But they've all been excellent members of the board and have contributed to thoughtful deliberation on variances and the like. So. I don't know if anybody has any specific questions or wants to talk about it, but I'd be happy to.
Thank you. Commissioners, is there discussion or would someone like to make a motion?
This is Ford. I move we adopt the recommendation.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Who is that? Just for the record.
Sorry, that was Bill Baxley. Sorry.
Hi, Bill. Okay, so I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Okay, clerk, please call the roll.
Baxley,
Aye.
Caprini, Smiley,
Aye.
Ford,
Aye.
Marwa,
Aye.
Guire, Meyer,
Aye.
Schrader, Sweezy,
Aye.
and I'm sorry, I'm not clear. Have we traditionally taken a vote from the vice president? Or
Honestly, does anyone else remember?
Yes, I do. I think that the vice president votes at the committee of the whole meetings.
okay. In that case, Olson.
Aye.
Thank you. That's 7 yeas.
All right. That motion passes. Thank you, Brad. The next item on our agenda is number 5, a land sale for 2837 Chicago Avenue, and staff is Ratana Sangsulijan.
Thank you. So I'm here before you to seek approval for consistency with the comp plan, the sale of 2837 Chicago Avenue. It's currently a vacant site, but we as a city receive a proposal to construct a 8-story parking structure on the site. Minneapolis 2040 guides the site as public office and institutional and Transit 10. And it's also along Chicago Avenue, which is guided as a goods and services corridor. Staff is recommending that the Plan Commission find that this land sale is consistent with the policy guidance of the comp plan. And that concludes my presentation, but I'm available if you have any questions.
Thank you. Commissioners, is there discussion on this item or would someone like to make a motion? Commissioner Meyer.
I believe Commissioner Smiley had a question first.
Oh.
For that.
Sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Smiley.
Thank you. I just wanted to maybe just help me remember this, because I think, is this part of the same project that we have seen before that was, the expansion of the hospital, I believe, and then on the south side was that parking structure. Is this that same parking structure?
Correct. So it's part of the Alina Hub transportation project, and
Okay.
this land sale transaction, or excuse me, today's action as part of this approval is part of that project. Yep.
Thank you.
Commissioner Meyer.
Yeah. I can't see how this is possibly consistent with goal 10 of the 2040 plan, which is, in 2040, Minneapolis will be resilient to the effects of climate change and diminishing natural resources, and will be on track to achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In the statement on this, if you go down a few paragraphs, it says that even with the adoption to electric cars, even if you assume like full adoption to electric cars, a 38% reduction in passenger miles traveled by automobile is needed to achieve the 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So to build a gargantuan 8-story parking garage, at a location next to the Greenway and where the D line is coming, a location that is Transit 10, it doesn't seem consistent to me at all. So I guess I would really press staff on your finding. Like, how did you find this land sale to be consistent with that?
Yes, Commissioner Meyer. So originally, the project was at COW back in April of 2020 with the original policy guidance, which was for future land use and built form. It was guided as parks and open space in both of those guidance and districts. Since then, the city submitted a comp plan amendment to the Met Council to amend those future land use and built form districts in order to allow the project to be in conformance with the policy guidance, which resulted in the city council adopting the new built form and land use guidance that you see forth today. I think as part of that specific goal, it's probably not consistent, but however, with at least the built form and future land use guidance, this staff is recommending that with this new comp plan amendment, that it brings the project under conformance.
So sorry, what is the new comp plan amendment?
So the comp plan amendment was from which as you see today in this review in the land sale form, it's Transit 10 and public public office and institutional, which would allow for the construction of this parking structure.
Okay. Is this the only opportunity? Oh.
So this is Kimberly. I just was going to add to that. The commission did see the comp plan amendment and found the change to be consistent with the comprehensive plan when the comp plan amendment was voted on. So, in the same regard, staff has found that the land sale is consistent with the comprehensive plan. The project itself will be in front of you in about a month or two. And at that time, you'll see all of the ways that the project itself is intending to comply with the comprehensive plan goals.
So for this land sale component, is today's meeting the final verdict on whether the land is sold, or is there an opportunity later on for public comment and things like that, or is this it?
So today's action is part of a Minnesota state statute requirement, which requires us as a city to seek consistency with the comprehensive plan in terms of any public land sale or acquisition. So that's the purposes of today's action. However, there are opportunities for public comment and feedback in front of the biz committee. I don't know if there's going to be a public hearing, but community members can provide public feedback to council members as part of that community, as part of this land sale transaction, but not the land use approval and development. And that will come at a later time, as Kimberly alluded to.
Okay, so this is the only time that it comes to the planning commission, but it will come later to the city council committee.
For the land sale transaction, yeah.
Right, okay. I think I'll be voting against this. This body previously voted against a different large new parking structure for the Federal Reserve. I think to not, this body, went against even approving the structure to not only just approve the structure, but also approve a land sale for it, I think is just really contrary to our goals.
This is Keith Ford.
Keith, hold on a second there. Commissioner Smiley is up next, and then I'll call on you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to, and I'm so sorry, maybe you did kind of cover this, Ratana, with your last comment, but basically, when you say this is consistent, you're talking about the land use and the built form not built form, the land use and the land use part of the comprehensive plan, and not necessarily the goals, because I feel like the goals are more qualitative and up for interpretation. Is that a fair assessment?
As part of this land sale review, it's looking at any adopted plans, including Minneapolis 2040, and in terms of consistency with the comprehensive plan, the core analysis looks at the built form and future land use guidance.
Okay,
that's part of that recommendation.
Yeah, that's what I thought, as that it's the land use and built form as opposed to the goals necessarily. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Ford.
Thank you. Being a newbie here, I'm not yet familiar with these terms, built form and so forth. I do understand the comprehensive plan, and I gather we're going to learn more about that later on in this meeting. But I still have a difficulty understanding how, what about the built form makes the built form requirements make a parking ramp on Chicago a good idea? In that, I'm very familiar with the area.
So maybe I'll just start with, within Minneapolis 2040, the core land use guidance comes in the shape of a future land use map, which guides the land uses, and then also the second piece is the built form map, which has a series of districts that guides the scale and size of development. So specifically for built form, this site is guided as Transit 10. And as part of that, the guidance recommends development of 2 to 10 stories. So within this specific analysis of this proposal, which is recommending an 8-story development of a parking structure, this would be consistent with that built form guidance within that range.
That I understand. I'm wondering what about a parking ramp as opposed to, say, an office building or whatever. It does seem kind of, and I don't know what Transit 10 is either, but one might assume it involves transit. Again, it's difficult for me to understand. I understand how an 8-story structure it apparently fits the rules, but it's difficult to understand why we would be. I know what kind of plan a parking ramp, another parking ramp, I should say, makes sense.
I see Kimberly's camera on, so I'm gonna let her jump in here and answer this question.
So in this case, again, the actual parking ramp project still needs to be evaluated by the commission on its own merit in terms of whether or not the ramp is consistent with the comp plan. So they are tied together in that we are, making a similar decision today on the land sale. This particular portion of the site is a small sliver of land adjacent to the greenway. I think one corner or one footing of the parking ramp would be on this sliver that has the parks and open space designation. The rest of the land is going to be used for a pedestrian connection down to the Midtown Greenway and some other landscaping improvements. The parking ramp itself is being looked at as adding investment to a regional healthcare facility on Chicago Avenue. And it does have a number of ways that it's meeting the comp plan. I don't have that staff report in front of me because it hasn't been written yet. I don't have the plans in front of me either, but I do know that they are taking those comp plan goals seriously in terms of adding electrical vehicle charging stations, dedicating the entire roof of the ramp to solar, and some other aspects, including ground floor commercial. That's all I have off the top of my head without seeing it. But that's just, kind of a broader overview of that. But again, you will be seeing that in detail and have an opportunity to make an action on the project itself at a future meeting.
One more question. So we're talking about a land sale right now, which sounds kind of final. When would conditions on that, the use of that land be imposed? I mean, what action would do that? And what's to stop them from? So what action would that I mean, for example, the access to the greenway makes sense. So how is that?
So those types of conditions would come into play as part of the actual land use applications for the development project.
And if we couldn't agree on that, they'd be sitting there owning the land, but no agreement yet by the city as to how it could be used.
Right. So this land sale is basically allowing them to make the application for the parking ramp.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Sweezy.
Thank you, Commissioner Olson. Yeah, just a couple of comments primarily for the benefit of our new commissioners. Welcome. Nice to talk with you. And just for a little bit of perspective, Commissioner Meyer, one of the things he said was that this commission voted down the parking ramp at the Federal Reserve Building. I'm sure that's the project he was talking about. That's correct. That was hardly a unanimous vote. So I want to be, I want to make the point here that, our votes are our own and every project is different, I think, and should be judged on its own merits. You probably know that as new commissioners, but I didn't want there to be any misunderstanding that was by one vote. Actually, I think it was a 5-4 vote on that. So we were hardly unanimous in that. A couple of other comments. I know we're going to talk about built form and everything in greater detail. The comp plan, as you probably know, is a massive document and there's many, many goals in it. And I'll just tell you, my personal practice is not to pick out one particular goal in it and say this doesn't meet that one, therefore a project should rise or fall on that. Again, this is just my 2 cents on that. And the last thing I would say about this project in particular is that I understand, and I'll ask staff to correct me if I'm wrong, but this is intended to provide additional parking for the Alina, the Abbott Northwestern complex at 28th and Chicago. And for projects like this, I tend to take healthcare providers at their word sometimes when they need parking for things, and we're not dealing with a population that can always take a bus or walk to something like this. So I'll be voting in support of this for those reasons, but I wanted to make those other comments. There's certainly nothing in the comp plan that says we're not going to have parking or cars anymore. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I think, frankly, using one example of something we voted down is misleading.
Commissioner. Right. Commissioner Baxley.
Yeah, one quick question. So just to clarify earlier, so the condition of the sale is not conditional of its use. Is that correct?
So part of this leading up to today's action, staff from our business development colleagues and staff in our development services here and under Kimberly's team has been working with the applicant Alina and the city to envision what the potential uses are for this specific site. So in terms of today's approval process is really for approval for consistency with the comprehensive plan. However, any other conditions as part of the project will come at a later time as part of the development review process.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Smiley.
Yeah, I just wanted to add kind of to what Commissioner Sweezy said, that I will also be supporting this, and this one parcel is part of that bigger development that, as I was asking that for, basically that whole Abbott Northwestern Alina Health office complex, and I do think, in fact, that I mean, I wish we had more parking structures to allow for more compact way of storing cars as opposed to surface lots. So I think that something like this would allow to free up street surface for bike lanes and other purposes, but also I also agree with Commissioner Sweezy that I mean, it would be the best case scenario if a project on all fronts meets everything possible. And I understand that it would be a matter of which goal we make priority in terms of the comprehensive plan. Is it access to all sorts of and modes of transportation versus is it to reduce the use of car and something like that? And they both exist. And which one comes first is kind of I mean, sometimes they can't mutually exist in projects. So I will be supporting this as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry, one more.
go ahead.
And again, newbies have lots of questions, so I appreciate you entertain that. I think I just want to understand the condition of this action, understand the ability to comment on the project later, and I think especially for parking, which is such a sensitive, I call it a bridge issue, structures are necessary. It's just positioning them for reuse down the road, flat floors, non-slope things that while we're solving the problem for today, we're not creating a thing that has to be torn down and rebuilt in a different way. So just wanted to register that. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Marwa.
Hi, I just had a quick process question for staff. Are we reviewing this land sale because it's a public land that's being sold, that parcel that we see? Is that why this one is up for discussion versus other ones? I'm just trying to understand.
Yep. So this is a city-owned land, and which we're going to be disposing to Alina, and as part of a state statute requirement. Yes, that's why we're reviewing it, and asking Planning Commission to approve for consistency with the comp plan.
Got it. And do we get to know how much it was sold for, or is that out of our purview?
I don't know that information, but I know it's would be publicly available. But I don't have that information. I know Lisa Passis, who's the coordinator for this project from our business development. They would have more information, but I can come back with that answer at a later time if that helps.
Okay. I was just solely out of curiosity. It just wasn't in our pager. I was just curious. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, commissioners, are there any other comments or questions?
I have one quick question. What was the former use? I'm curious. Was it an alley, or it's a small piece of land, a strip of land?
I don't know its historical use, but it's adjacent to the Midtown Greenway,
right.
As you know today. But that's to the extent that I'm familiar with the site.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, commissioners, if there's no more discussion, would anyone like to make a motion? Commissioner Marwa. Oh. Yeah, go ahead.
I make a motion to approve this land sale.
For consistency with the comp plan?
For consistency with the comp plan.
Great. Do I have a second?
I second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Okay.
Actually, just I think to council members Ford comment, I think it's actually green space right now. Having biked through there many times, I think it's a slope that's been developed. It's mostly green. It's a bit of park that kind of wanders down to the greenway on a slope.
All right, any other discussion? All right, seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Commissioner Baxley,
Approve.
Caprini, Ford,
Aye.
Marwa,
Aye.
McGuire, Meyer,
No.
I'm sorry, I'm out of order here. A Smiley,
Aye.
Schrader, Sweezy,
Aye.
Aye.
that's 6 yeas and 1 nay.
All right, that motion passes. Thank you, Ratana. So next up is our discussion agenda, which is built form regulations training, and staff is Jason Wittenberg and Janelle Whitmire.
Thank you, commissioners. We're also joined by Joe Bernard. He was not placed on the agenda, but he's joining us as well. I'm Jason Wittenberg. I'm the manager of code development. Janelle Whitmire is a principal planner in code development, and Joe Bernard, a planning project manager in code development. The code development team is a small group that's primarily focused on regulatory improvement, which includes but isn't limited to the implementation of our new comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040. New built form regulations were adopted in December, took effect January 1st. That's what the code development team spent an awful lot of its time on in 2020. One thing that we're doing now is making sure that people understand these standards, those who need to understand them. We've done some training sessions for our staff, and we had a very well attended session geared more toward design professionals and developers within the past couple of weeks. We think this session for planning commissioners could be a little less detailed than some of those sessions. So there are some things that we might gloss over a little bit, just given that although it's good for commissioners to know the regulations generally, it's not as though you're sitting at the development review counter needing to answer every question that is. And some of this info will come across probably as a little repetitive for those who have been on the commission dating back since before this year. We've got a series of slides that we're going to run through. I suspect that we'll take a half hour or perhaps more to run through them. I think will probably be best served if we hold the questions until the end, after we've had a chance to run through those slides. And of course, we can try and scroll back to them too if people need to come back to a particular slide with if there's a specific question about something on a slide. Me, Janelle, and Joe will kind of hand it off back and forth throughout this presentation, and at the moment I will turn it over to Joe. You might be muted, Joe.
Boy, how embarrassing. Thank you. Glad to see some new faces here. As Jason said, I'm Joe Bernard, planner in code development. I'll just give you, to start off here, kind of a broad overview of what we're talking about. In the broadest sense, the major intended outcomes here of our work is listed on this slide. It's the outcomes that we aimed for as staff drafting the new built form regulations, and I know some of you commissioners and of course our council members considered them in the approval process as well. Jason and Janelle are going to cover most of how we think this has been accomplished in greater detail in our regulations this evening, with summaries of the changes to our regulations around floor area ratio, height, our new premiums system, lot size, setbacks, all that good stuff. So in case it's not clear, these regulations are now in effect. All projects moving forward are going to be reviewed based on these regulations. And this includes 13 new overlay zoning districts that cover every single property in the city. And those are matched to the built form districts that are described in Minneapolis 2040. Aside from achieving goals itself in the plan, these regulations we hope that they're going to create a greater predictability in the development process for everyone involved. And since these new districts now reflect official policy, something that's important to note is that we're moving away from an era where we had policy documents that called for greater development potential than what our zoning allowed. That relationship in the past resulted in some pretty wild variance requests at times, and we're anticipating that moving forward, and those were appropriate in that context, but we have new context, and we anticipate that variances are going to be much less common, and they'll be reserved for really unique situations. So the lesson here is that the development potential that you have in your zoning is what you get, and that's part of the whole goal of predictability. Along those same lines, there's now limits on the amount of height increase you can request. Janelle will go over that process in greater detail here in a moment. But to give a kind of a quick overview is that you're no longer able to request a 20-story building in a built form overlay district that's guided for 4 stories, for example, not without changing Minneapolis 2040 itself. So the general rule here is that you cannot request a height increase beyond the maximum height allowed in the next most intense district. Again, Janelle will go over that in greater detail if that's not clear, but anything beyond that will require amending Minneapolis 2040, which we would consider a more serious and more onerous process for a developer to go through. Last thing before we move on to some of the initial changes in the zoning ordinance is that we want to make clear that this does not mean the end of rezoning requests. There's going to be some uses that you're going to find are allowed on a given property that have not changed with this process. So a development site might still be zoned for single family zoning in the sense that it doesn't allow buildings larger than that, or it doesn't allow uses more intense than that. So it might have R1A zoning matched with Corridor 4 overlay district. The message here is just what that means is that you're still going to see rezonings for the base zoning district, even though until we move forward with our land use rezoning study, hopefully later this year. So even though the built form district might say a 4-story building is appropriate, the base zoning might need to be changed. Okay. So first thing we're going to jump into is just some changes to key definitions in the zoning ordinance that are important here. The new definitions are really intended to provide some clarity of intent, but also they change the way the regulations are applied. So the first one here is really important. We've changed the definition of gross floor area to mean that structured parking is now included in the floor area ratio calculation. Previously, we did not count it towards FAR. This is somewhat offset by changes to that floor area ratio limits themselves that are more permissive than they were previously. So the intent here is that the floor area ratio number really should truly capture what the bulk of the building is by including that parking, and hopefully that will encourage some better design outcomes. The definition of story has changed a bit too. We're removing the 14-foot limit on height for an individual story. Previously, if you had a 20-foot floor, story, that would be counted as 2 stories based on the zoning ordinance. Instead, we're going to move forward relying on regulating height of the overall building. In addition to that, the definition of mezzanine has been altered to just match or rely on the definition in the building code. Last thing to note, which we feel is important to pay attention to, is that there's a new public realm definition, and that is included in part because it's something referenced in new findings for the height increases. So I know definitions aren't super exciting, but wanted to make sure that we brought that in front of you. Next, I'm going to hand this off to, I think, Janelle. It's going to cover floor area ratio changes in the interior districts.
I think I've actually got these next slides. Thank you, okay. Joe. Floor area ratio is probably perhaps a term that's new for some of you. Essentially, it's a equation that relates to the amount of building floor area related to the amount of lot area. So an FAR of 1.0, for example, would mean you have 10,000 square feet of floor area in the building on a 10,000 square foot lot. This is just demonstrating this table. The floor area ratio numbers in the interior districts are lowest intensity districts. Joe referenced single family zoning earlier. That was a little bit of a misstatement. We actually no longer have, of course, single family zoning districts. Our lowest intensity districts are R1A now do allow duplexes and triplexes, and this is the table that governs how much floor area can be in those particular uses in these built form districts. Next slide, please. Again, just this demonstrates the increasing intensity of the floor area ratio as you get to more intensive built form districts. And one thing to note here is that in the same built form district, we allow a greater FAR in non-residential zoning than we do in the residence and office residence districts. So that's one way that we differentiate between, say, a R1A site in Corridor 4 versus a commercially zoned site in Corridor 4. The general rationale there is that in the non-residential zoning districts, you don't have things like setback standards generally, or lot coverage or impervious surface maximums. So you more quickly kind of fill up that volume of the entire lot when you don't have those types of standards. So there's a little bit more inherent flexibility in those commercial non-residential districts compared to the residence and office residence districts. Next slide, please. It's worth noting that we have more extensive use of minimum floor area ratio standards. The intent is to ensure that we are not getting significant underutilization of property, particularly in areas where there have been significant transit investments. And you see, again, that the minimum FAR also gets a little bit more intense as the built form district gets more intense. So in Corridor 6, for example, where Minneapolis 2040 says that buildings should generally be at least 2 stories, a minimum FAR of 1.0 is generally going to get you a building with 2 stories, just from the fact that it's nearly impossible to literally fill up every square foot of a site with a 1-story building. We don't typically see that, for example. Next slide, please. We formerly had just a few bonuses that were applicable to outside of our downtown. We have expanded the range of things that allow a development to increase their allowed floor area, and we now refer to those as premiums. Rather than it being based on a % increase, is now a number that you simply add on to the base allowance. So the math is a little bit easier for people like me who aren't math whizzes. Again, although we have a much wider range of bonuses or premiums to choose from, you can see in this middle column in this table that there are limits to the number of premiums that may be awarded in most districts up to Transit 20. In the Transit 30 and Core 50, there's no limit on the number of premiums that may be awarded to a project. And we try to make sure that the premiums are very clearly documented in the staff report so that someone can follow along very simply, very clearly, sort of how we got to a building that maybe has 4.2 FAR in a district that's normally limited to 4. We want to make sure we're very open and transparent about that. Next slide, please. The Planning Commission doesn't, of course, deal with single-family homes, duplexes, and triplexes very frequently. So we have, in our previous presentations to others, we had more slides that focused on that scale of development. We won't go into this in much detail here, but this table shows the maximum floor area ratio that was adopted for that scale of development. And there are 2 bonuses or premiums that were put into the ordinance to allow duplexes and triplexes in some contexts to get additional floor area, an affordable housing premium, as well as an environmental sustainability certification premium, which we're still sort of determining which third-party certifications will qualify for that particular bonus. Next slide, please. Now with height, we will turn it over to Janelle.
Thank you, Jason. So our comprehensive plan had clear guidance for stories in each of the built form overlay districts, or built form districts, excuse me. So in the ordinance now, we're continuing to regulate overall height in feet and stories. But as Joe mentioned, now there's not that limit on the height of an individual story. The maximum height limits exist on all of the built form districts except the Core 50 district. There are still some height exceptions that can apply in these districts for things like parapets and rooftop mechanical equipment. There are also minimum height requirements that apply. These are in the same districts where we have minimum FAR requirements, and they're shown here in the table. They do apply to at least 50% of a building footprint. The minimum height requirement can apply to existing buildings when they're expanding. So if the existing building is expanded by 100% or more of the existing floor area, it's going to trigger that minimum height requirement. Next slide, please. When we're looking at increasing maximum height, we know that's still going to be a thing, but based on the comp plan guidance, the interior districts, built form districts, and units with 1 to 3, or dwellings with 1 to 3 units, and cluster developments are only going to be allowed to increase their height by variance. There just wasn't guidance in the comp plan to generally allow increases for these uses and locations. So generally we expect that if height increase is requested in the interior district or any of these other uses, that those findings are just generally going to be a little bit more difficult to make. And I would expect that the Planning Commission would see some potential requests for variances in the interior districts for residences with 4 or more units. Next slide, please. For eligible uses and locations, so that would include corridor, transit, production, and parks built form districts, the height could be increased by an administrative application rather than a conditional use permit, which was required before. There are some exceptions that can apply, and that would be in the Shoreline Overlay District, as well as the Mississippi River Critical Area Overlay District, where a conditional use permit will continue to be required. So those will, of course, continue to go to the Planning Commission. when we're looking at these height increases, there are 3 requirements that are going to apply. The first requirement is that the increased limits are going to apply in each district to ensure that the intended scale of the districts are maintained and to increase predictability for what can be authorized in those districts. As Joe noted previously, there were no limits. You could basically ask for anything. So now the way it's structured, height increases can exceed the height of the next higher built form district. So for example, in corridor 3, where the maximum height is 3 stories, the next built form district would be corridor 4, where the maximum height is 4 stories. So corridor 3, you could, with a height increase allowance, go up to a 4-story building. Beyond that, you're going to need to ask for a comprehensive plan amendment and a rezoning. And those, of course, would start with the Planning Commission and then have to be approved by the council if they're to be allowed. Excuse me. The second requirement is that adequate premiums need to be provided, and the applicable standards for those premiums need to be met. With each premium, they further the goals of the comprehensive plan. In the shoreline districts and the critical area districts, just one thing to note is that premiums are only going to be required for that portion of the height that exceeds the built form district maximum. So if the height increase is just really to allow what's allowed by the built form district, there's a potential that they would not need to provide the premiums. That information will be outlined in the staff report. Another thing to note is that if either of the first 2 requirements are not met, the increase cannot be considered. So it's very important that they comply with the limit, the increase limit, as well as providing those adequate premiums. Then the third finding relates to the new legal findings that are required, and there are 4 of those, as shown on your screens. So with these findings, discretion can be applied through them, and that means that the height increase application can be approved or denied, or conditions can be imposed for both the administrative or the conditional use permit applications. And then just some information on the process. Whichever application applies, administrative or conditional use permit, those applications have to be processed concurrently with any other required land use applications. So just to give you a better idea of what happens with the administrative application, we're expecting that when a height increase application is requested, there's also going to be a site plan review application. We think that'll be pretty typical. So with that site plan review report, the findings, analysis, and actions for the height increase application will be included in the zoning analysis section. So that will be available for reference. So same thing, same way that we would identify the information for any FAR premiums that a project would happen to qualify for. One other thing that just to be aware of is that the decision date for both the height increase application and site plan review application, or any other application that might apply, will be the same. And that's in the event that there's an appeal. We want those to proceed together to the city council. So if an administrative decision is appealed, it goes directly to the city council because there isn't authorization for the planning commission to overturn that decision or make any changes, alterations to the decision. So no conditions of approval could be added, for example. That means that the focus of the public hearing will need to be on the applications that are before the commission and what you're considering. And then in those instances where a conditional use permit is still required to increase the height, just as before, that application would proceed through the public hearing process. But obviously there's different findings that would now need to be addressed. Next slide, please. I think this goes back to Jason. Yes.
Thank you, Janelle. I won't cover these in detail. We have talked a little bit about premiums. As mentioned, there is a wider menu of options to obtain premiums. The height related premiums are generally intended to be a little bit more difficult to achieve. So for example, with I believe the mixed use premium, for example, the standard for meeting that premium is a little bit higher in order to obtain the height increase compared to the FAR increase. So that they aren't necessarily the exact same language in the FAR and the height categories. Then there's in addition to these 8 menu items you see here for FAR premiums in corridor 3 through the production districts, there's actually a larger menu of options in the Transit 30 and Core 50 district. Some of those are little bit more specific to kind of a downtown or downtown-like setting, rather than being applicable outside of the downtown area. And as noted, again, there are limits on the number of premiums that can be awarded for any given project. Next slide, please. Lot dimensions. So this covers things like the minimum lot width, minimum lot area, and maximum lot area. Let's see. I'll just note that we are making much more extensive use of maximum lot area than we have in the past. The general idea is that that's a way to control the scale of development to make sure that it aligns with the intent of each built form district. We have some corridor districts that are along areas that have not historically had very intensive development, and the intent of those areas is not that we're going to have 250 units, 300-foot long buildings. So the maximum size lot area is one way that we are kind of controlling for that. People can request a planned unit development or a cluster development on lots that are exceeding those maximum lot areas. However, the planned unit development regulations also have rules that guide the size of individual buildings within the PUD to get at the issue that I just mentioned. There are some exemptions from maximum lot area. For example, schools or other institutional uses that are side by side with in the same districts as homes have obviously different space needs, and we exempted some of those uses from maximum lot area standards. Next slide. And the table in the lower right or lower left, excuse me, it shows the maximum square footage in those districts where we have maximum lot area standards. And here you can see, as a general rule of thumb, the number of kind of standard city lots that can be combined in each of those districts. So generally in an interior 1, lots are not intended to be combined into larger lots. Interior 2 can generally combine 2 standard lots. And this small little map here on the lower right just shows an example of a corridor 4 built form districts along Lowry Avenue Northeast. It shows that those are mapped 4 parcels deep from that corridor, and the corridor 4 built form lot area maximum would accommodate, for example, the combination of those 4 standard parcels into a redevelopment site. Of course, where you have the longer north-south corridors with something like corridor 4 zoning that's not quite as, doesn't work out quite as neatly that way, where you have that natural break. Just an observation along some of the east-west corridors, that was the general extent to which we mapped corridor 4 as an example. Next slide, please. And here is just an example of how this would play out in different built form districts. Here's a development project, newer building, maybe developed 5 years or so ago, 3535 Grand Avenue. The lot size is a little over 15,000 square feet. So this is an example of a project that would be allowed in terms of the lot size in Interior 3, but would be on too large of a lot for the Interior 2 district. Again, to really align with the descriptions of those built form districts in Minneapolis 2040. Next slide, please. Let's see, 1 to 3 unit residential buildings. We had, when we adopted regulations that allowed up to 3 units on every parcel that allows, that was formerly single family zoning, we adopted maximum lot sizes to ensure that again, we maintained the scale that's intended in those districts, and the built form regulations that were just adopted did not change those standards that were adopted about a year ago. I think that's the only major point on this slide. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it back to Janelle.
Thank you, Jason. So moving on to yard requirements. Generally, most of the yard requirements are going to be found in the residence and office residence districts, just as before, that's where they would apply. And just briefly with front yard requirements, we still have a district requirement that would apply depending on which built form district you're in. And as before, there are some requirements that are based on the established setback of adjacent properties. So depending on what the adjacent properties, how they're set back, your minimum front yard requirement could be increased or in some cases decreased. And then a new thing that came out of the built form amendment is that in the OR districts, it is possible to eliminate a front yard requirement if a mixed use building is proposed that meets the standards for the mixed use FAR premium. So if those standards are met, that front yard requirement could be eliminated and allows for the building to be built up to the lot line or other encroachments such as a patio, things that wouldn't normally be allowed in that front yard requirement to be located there without needing a variance. Next slide, please. Looking at corner side yard requirements and in general, just the rest of the yard requirements for interior side yard and rear yard requirements, those requirements have generally become a little less restrictive. And now we are basing those requirements off of building height in feet rather than stories. So we are able to base the ranges of the feet on average heights of projects that we had seen come in before the amendment. So generally a 3-story building, residential building, is only going to have an 8-foot corner side yard setback, whereas before it would usually require a 12-foot setback. So usually there's going to be a 4-foot difference for average sized buildings. Now, if floor heights are taller, that means your setback requirements are going to be greater. And then another thing to note with this, as with the front yard requirements, when you're in the OR districts, there's that potential again to eliminate your corner side yard requirement if a mixed use building is proposed that meets those standards for the FAR premium. Next slide, please. Interior side yard requirements. A lot of the same stuff that I just mentioned for corner side yard requirements apply, generally less restrictive. We're basing it off of building height in feet rather than stories. Your minimum setback requirement could be 5 feet rather than 9 feet for a typical 3-story residential building. There are some exceptions that apply to this table on your screen. Generally, 1 to 3 unit dwellings are going to have different, in the interior districts, are going to have different setback requirements. Since you generally don't see those, I won't get into that too much. Another exception would be long building requirements. So we're defining a long building as a building that extends more than 75 feet of the length of the property. In that case, the side yard setback is going to increase by 2 feet. In rare situations where we would have a quarter 6 or a transit property abutting an interior 1 or interior 2 district, and the building proposed on that site is at least about a 5-story building, that side yard setback is going to increase by another 5 feet from what's shown in the table. And then the last exception would be for institutional uses in Interior 1 and Interior 2 districts where they exceed 28 feet tall, which is in some situations allowed now. That setback requirement is going to increase from 5 feet to 7 feet. Next slide, please. Just looking at commercial, downtown, and industrial districts, generally we still don't have yard requirements that apply except when a property is adjacent to a residential or office residential district, or if there's a residential use. We did incorporate some exceptions for properties when they're adjacent to goods and services corridors where that reflective front yard setback would no longer apply. And there are, well, if there's a dwelling with 1 or 2 units, just note that they would have separate yard requirements. But again, generally probably not something that you as the commission would see. And then just one other note is we still allow obstructions, certain obstructions into required yards. So there were some updates with that, but those tables I showed you, there are some exceptions that could additionally apply for smaller obstructions. Next slide, please. With the impervious surface and lot coverage requirements, in some districts we have them, in other districts they don't apply. So kind of where you'd expect to see them, that's where they are, and they are more graduated than they were before. And it is possible that even in some residence or office residence districts, there is no requirement, such as in Core 50, in the Core 50 built form district. And these numbers were designed to work with the allowed FAR for the districts as well. Next slide, please. We do expect maybe more cluster developments will be proposed. I think we've seen an increase in these types of developments more recently. So just wanted to note a few changes related to this type of development. They do have separate FAR and height requirements that apply. They're generally more restrictive than what other uses in those districts would be allowed. And just again, when we're looking at the height requirements, the height can only be increased by variance for cluster developments in any built form district. With the lot size requirements, just one thing to know is that minimum lot size requirements per dwelling unit are still going to apply in R1 through R4. So although you may have more opportunities to do cluster developments, the opportunity isn't there to just add as many units as someone could propose. And also the maximum lot size requirement is still determined by the conditional use permit. There were no other updates to the development standards for cluster developments. Next slide, please. Then moving on to planned unit developments, again, could see more of these. So some of the changes around planned unit developments, the minimum lot size requirement has been reduced to 1/2 acre from 1 acre. Jason kind of touched on that we now have limitations on the size of individual buildings that apply in the interior and corridor districts. And this is related to the maximum lot size requirements that are in those districts. So the table shown on your screen identifies what a developer could propose in those districts. If they go above what would be allowed for that, there is the possibility. First, I'll start with they would be required to break up the building essentially into 1 or more buildings to comply with the table. However, there is the opportunity for someone to request an exception. So that's an additional alternative that has been authorized. But with that exception, there's certain criteria that have to be met. So the staff report will outline, a recommendation based on those criteria that the Planning Commission could then consider in allowing or not allowing for the development. Another significant change with planned unit developments, there are no longer alternatives for floor area ratio and height. Since we have those other means of increasing FAR and height, that's been removed from the PUD. And another note is we're not allowing double counting amenities that would be allowed through the PUD with premiums that are authorized for FAR and height. So they would have to do separate ones, where with FAR and height, you can kind of the premiums kind of work together, and that wouldn't be considered double counting, but they couldn't then use those same premiums for amenities for the PUD. Next slide, please. So that covers the updates to the built form regulations, but we did want to point out some resources that are available. The first is a built form guide that's been produced, and it's a handout, so it has kind of compiles all of the regulations for each of the districts and just is a quick reference guide. So as you can see on your screen here, this is for Corridor 6, so it includes applicable regulations, the district description, where you can find it, and then some key provisions. We did also call out regulations specific to 1 to 3 units because they are still generally regulated just a bit differently than other uses in each district. We can certainly make this available to the commission. It's a 14 megabyte document, so we didn't think it would be a good idea to email it out to you, but we can maybe have it uploaded into SharePoint, so you can refer to this. Eventually, it will be uploaded onto the website, and we're in the process of making those updates, so hopefully sooner than later. People can refer to our, Joe, could you go back to the previous slide? People can refer to the Minneapolis 2040 website and the code development website. What we're hoping to have up there is just more information for people to refer to and have a better understanding of what these changes to the ordinance mean, and can find what they need, as we're still happen to be waiting for Municode, which is our online code, to be updated, and we don't have a timeline yet on when that is going to be completed. So if you're looking to find the ordinance online right now, we can just provide the link where you can find it on the council's website, the council action. It's unfortunately just a PDF, so it's not the easiest document to look at, but so those handouts we expect are going to be very useful in the interim until we have our Municode code updated. I believe that covers all of the resource information. I'll turn it back to Jason.
Thank you, Janelle. So just sort of to summarize a key point or two, as Joe kind of alluded to, especially our regulations now allow big buildings where our policies call for them. So previously, as Joe definitely mentioned, we had some massive variances, and the basis for some of those variances was, well, our policies say we should have larger buildings here than our code calls for. That should no longer be the basis for a variance. The fact that we had a court case recently where that was made clear by the courts that that kind of rationale should not be the basis for a variance any longer. We are not under the illusion that we've gotten every regulation perfect. So we will be curious to see how this plays out. And, we have this team dedicated now to regulatory improvement, and we'll be as responsive as we can to fixing things that aren't working as well as they should. But we think this is a major, major leap forward in a variety of ways, including not the least of which is ensuring that development is much more predictable for those who are trying to build something in the city and those who are having something built near where they live, for example. With that, we're happy to hear any questions that any of you have.
Thank you. Commissioners, any questions for Jason, Janelle, or Joe? Oh, Commissioner Smiley.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Olson, and thank you, the team. I always have a fun time seeing like all of your names start with J. So thank you for your presentation. It's very detailed. I asked that if I can look at the presentation later, because I'm like, I am definitely not retaining all of this information in this moment. I do have a couple of questions for you. One is, and I apologize that if you mentioned it and it wasn't clear to me, what is the next step? Is this coming back to the Planning Commission, or is the next step going to city council as part of the basically code update and just, calling it good. And then my other question is that you did mention, Jason, in the very beginning of your presentation that you have done a similar presentation in more detail for developers, and just kind of talking about how this built form regulations and updates impact those developments. And I guess I would just say I personally am interested to see what the developers heard. I know you said it's much more detailed and the commission probably doesn't need to know that much detail, but I also feel like it would be very helpful when projects come to a place such as the Committee of the Whole, when we're discussing all the bits and pieces of the project and the materials they've used and things like that, which I'm hoping someone else can point out when the time comes. And I feel like it would be beneficial to know what they at least think they know. So
Sure.
if there's any other one of those sessions, if it's recorded, I would love to listen to it, or something along those lines, I guess.
Sure. Thank you for those questions. I didn't mean to give the impression that we left out a lot of stuff from what we presented to design professionals and developers. Most of what we eliminated was the single family, two family, and triplex stuff, and then a handful of bullet points. So it wasn't that much that we took out. We're happy to share that version of the presentation. Again, the rationale there was partly the sake of time here, and also that although it's good that our planning commissioners to have a pretty good, at least cursory understanding of the zoning code, we don't expect you to have the same level of expertise as someone who's working at the zoning counter or who's designing a building based on, the zoning rules, for example. But I didn't, again, mean to give the impression that we're cheating you out of a lot of information. But I appreciate that. To your first question, I mean, these rules are now adopted and the law of the land as of January 1st. So we are now moving on after we kind of get all these resources, training resources out there. We are moving on to other types of regulatory implementation, which will include tackling the land use primary zoning districts. As Joe alluded to in one of his slides, we're going to have some odd mismatches in the meantime between primary zoning districts and built form districts, where you've got that, the zoning districts that allow only up to triplexes, but it's in corridor 6 or something like that. So that will be a big thing for us to tackle that will not be ready for adoption yet this year. So this year we will be bringing forward some, I don't know if smaller is the right word, but other changes like site plan review standards that are another step toward Minneapolis 2040 implementation, kind of post built form adoption.
Commissioner Meyer.
Jason, you mentioned a court case that changed what variances are allowed, and I'm not familiar with that. Can you just expand on that? Like what changed? What was available to be considered before, but now the court's saying that we can't?
Sure. Some of you might remember a development project at the corner of 26th and Blaisdell. The city approved a development there that required some number of variances, and the court has overturned that approval. And as part of that, they have said you can't use your code not being up to date as the reason for granting a variance. So, for example, we've had places in the past prior to the built form being adopted where our policies have called for mid-rise or even high-rise buildings, and our floor area ratio regulations just haven't even been close to being aligned with that. And so the rationale for that we stated in the variances was, well, we've got this mismatch between our policies and regulations. The court said that we shouldn't do that any longer. And fortunately, we shouldn't have a reason to do that, that specific type of variance any longer.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Commissioners, are there any other questions?
One more.
Commissioner Exley.
Jason, thanks so much. That was terrific overview, a lot to learn there. I was just curious, little article in the paper this morning about the challenge to that from some environmental groups to the 2040 plan, and how if you could just comment on that. I'm assuming we're still running forward until things change, but how potentially or what impact that may or may not have.
Sure. Yes. The Minnesota Supreme Court acted yesterday or this week to reinstate the lawsuit challenging the Minneapolis 2040 plan. Our city attorney's office has made it clear that we can and should continue to move ahead with the regulatory implementation of the plan. And just to be clear, that decision certainly did not overturn the adoption of the plan. It was a procedural decision, essentially saying that the lower court erred in throwing out the lawsuit and that the lawsuit may continue. So there's going to be a long period of the discovery phase now ahead in the lawsuit, we expect. But from our standpoint, there will be no slowing down in the type of work that we just presented here today.
Great, thank you.
Does anyone else have questions for staff? All right, well, thank you, Joe, Janelle, and Jason.
All right, good to see everybody and nice to meet newer commissioners, and I look forward to working with you some more.
Thank you. All right. So next, Kimberly, do we have any updates from staff?
Trying to unmute myself here. No updates at this time other than to let you know we are still planning on having a retreat for the commission. Hopefully, we were hoping to have it in February. I don't know if we're still going to be able to get that on the calendar, but we did want to get this built form presentation in front of you as soon as we could, just knowing that you're going to have projects coming your way that are subject to the new regulations. So with that, I think there's still going to be some opportunity to take smaller pieces of that work and evaluate them and discuss them at a retreat that will either happen at the end of February or beginning of March. And I think that was really the only other update I had, other than just another welcome to the new commissioners. Bill, I understand you were on the phone on Monday, but just had technology issues, so I'm glad you were able to connect tonight. So welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a note to everybody. You can't run Teams through your own work. You have to log out of that and log into your new Teams. That was the step I missed. So I was able to listen in as an attendee, but I was saying a lot of things, but nobody was picking it up. So so I'm glad to have it figured out. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate the patience with me. So
I have a question. Keith Ford here. So there was a reference, I see that somebody has, on the chat line, had asked for a copy of this slide deck, which is great. But there's also a reference to the built form summary document. Is that going to be available somewhere?
Jason, do you want to take that?
I'm still here and can speak to that. As you can tell, I'm now in the dark, only lighted by the glow of my laptop. Yes, we might, given the size of the document, we might just have to work with the clerk to share it by SharePoint or something rather than emailing it out to everyone, but we will make sure we can get that in your hands or access to it.
Thank you.
All right, commissioners, are there any other items anyone would like to discuss before we adjourn this evening?
Yeah, hi, this is Anisha. I was just mentioning that I saw that Lisa updated our calendars, so I see all the committee of the whole meetings now on our calendars, but I don't see the Monday public meetings. So.
Yeah, I think that's one may just not be on the calendar yet.
So the invites for the actual live Monday meetings are sent out from the clerk's office, and those are sent out by our IT team about 24 hours before the meeting.
Okay.
So you typically don't get those until much closer to it.
Okay, and then those get popped onto the Microsoft Teams calendar at that point. Got it.
Correct.
Yeah, because that's usually how I join. I just click onto the app on my Mac and then join, and then those meetings just seem to be disappearing a bunch. So, thank you. They're all up there now, though. I see them.
Okay. I just had a couple housekeeping things, especially for our newest commissioners. So welcome. We're glad to have you guys. And these are also just good reminders for all of us. In our Monday meetings, the IT staff have asked that we keep our cameras on when we're speaking and off when we're not speaking. And same thing with microphones, on when you're speaking, off when you're not. And then we never, I don't know if anyone ever told you guys this, but to comment or ask questions in the meeting, we write in the chat on the side of the meeting. So do you guys see where that is? Yeah. Yeah. So just say, you know, I have a question or I have a motion, and we're all learning how to do these virtual meetings, but that's kind of what we're trying to stick to. And then the chat is also in the public record. So anything you say in there is part of the public record, and the clerk's office just wants us to make sure that it's all business, I guess. So does anyone have anything else? If not, I will adjourn the meeting.
I just have one last reminder, Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, go ahead.
Along the lines of what you just mentioned about the chat, in the Monday meetings, at least since those are officially like official public meetings, and just something that anything related to, like if you are in fact asking a question, making a comment, even making a motion, all of that, they all have to be eventually verbalized. So you can't ask a question related to the items in the chat. The chat can be related to technical difficulties and things like that. However, when you, for example, put motion or second or question, you will be called on by the chair of the meeting so to verbalize that. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yes, good point. All right, anything else? Okay, thank you, everybody. This meeting is adjourned. Oh, and our next meeting is the Committee of the Whole meeting on February 25th, 2021.
Wonderful. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.